My name is Angelo. I have been a doctor for years, specializing in general surgery and intensive care. Throughout my career, I have entered operating rooms that looked like true battlefields against time. I have witnessed cases where medicine had all the resources, and yet the outcome was not what we expected. But I have also lived through situations where, in the absence of scientific explanations, something greater seemed to intervene. Today, I am going to share with you one of those stories that has never left my memory. Stories that remind me every day that medicine goes beyond scalpels, protocols, and diagnoses. There are moments when we are merely witnesses to something inexplicable. That night, when I walked into the operating room, I had no idea I was about to live through one of the most striking episodes of my professional life. I was exhausted, coming off a nearly 36-hour shift, but the urgency of that case demanded all my attention. I knew a young man's life was hanging by a thread, and every second could determine his fate. I am not the kind of doctor who usually talks much about his personal life, but there is something you may need to understand before hearing this story. I have always deeply believed in science. I was trained to trust numbers, tests, and evidence, and, to a certain extent, that faith in logic carried me through countless nights on call. However, when life decides to surprise us, even the most solid truths we have learned can begin to tremble. That's how that night began. I remember walking into the hospital and sensing the tense atmosphere in the air. The nurses were agitated, the technicians were rushing back and forth, and the patient was already being prepared for emergency surgery. There was no time for long conversations, only for quick decisions. I still remember the first time I saw him lying on the gurney. He was a young man, barely over 20, pale, eyes closed, breathing short and irregular. The monitor was already showing worrying signs. He had lost a lot of blood, and at that moment, it was as if his body were suspended on a thin line between life and death. As I scrubbed in for surgery, a nurse approached me and whispered, "Doctor, the family is desperate. They want to know if he's going to make it." I looked at her, took a deep breath, and said, "Tell them we will do everything we possibly can." That wasn't just a standard response. It was the truth. But deep inside, I knew we were facing an uneven battle. And that was precisely what made everything more striking. When hope seems minimal, every gesture inside the operating room becomes a battle for life. And it was that night, before that patient, that science and the inexplicable met. That night, I stood before a scene I had never imagined witnessing. The patient was already on the operating table, and his life seemed to slip away with every heartbeat. The monitor beeped irregularly, the numbers were dropping, and everyone in the room knew time was against us. I clearly remember the heavy silence that lingered for a few seconds, broken only by the sounds of the machines and the hurried footsteps of the team. The young man's breathing was unstable, his body was already showing signs of failure, and the looks on the faces around me reflected the same question I carried inside. Would we still be able to save him? And before I continue this story, I need to ask something of you watching me now. This channel only grows because you actively participate. So be part of this chain. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and write in the comments a phrase I carry with me in all cases like this. I believe in miracles. I need at least 100 comments for YouTube to deliver this video to more people, and I know you can help me with that. Back to that night. The atmosphere inside the room was one of extreme urgency. The anesthesia team was ready, nurses checked the instruments, and the technicians arranged every detail. It was a silent choreography of hands that knew they could not make a mistake. And yet, despite all this synchronicity, there was a shadow hanging over us. The feeling that we could lose that young man at any moment. I felt a tightness in my chest when I first touched the patient. His skin was cold, pale. The weakened body revealed the silent struggle that had already been going on for hours before reaching us. He had suffered a severe internal hemorrhage, and his system was collapsing. The anesthesiologist gave me a firm look and said, "Doctor, his vitals are dropping fast. We need to act now." I nodded and answered without hesitation, "Let's begin." Right there, at that moment, the life of a young man was literally in our hands. And it was then that I noticed something different in the room. I cannot explain it scientifically, but there was an almost palpable energy in the air, as if something greater were present. Even with all the pressure, part of me felt we were not alone in that surgery. As the minutes went by, the monitor's warning signals grew increasingly alarming. Each beep sounded like a cruel reminder of how close we were to the edge. The team was in total concentration, but I could see in their eyes a mixture of fear and hope. In my mind, I repeated, "He cannot give up now. Not here, not today." And, in that scenario where science revealed its limits, the unexpected began to show signs that it was about to happen. Before opening the surgical field, my mind was invaded by an image that has never left me. The look in that young man's mother's eyes. Just moments before he was taken into the operating room, she held his hand so tightly, it seemed she wanted to transfer her own life into him. Silent tears ran down her face, but her eyes shone with unshakable faith. When I approached, she lifted her head, still with her fingers intertwined with her son's, and asked me in a low voice, "Doctor, will he survive?" It was one of the hardest questions I've ever heard. Not because I didn't know the severity, but because at that moment I didn't want to give a cold answer based only on statistics. I took a deep breath, touched her shoulder, and said, "He is in good hands. We will do everything within our reach." She closed her eyes as if those words were the last thread of hope she could hold on to. The young man's name was Gabriel. He was only 23 years old, an engineering student, full of plans for the future, described by friends as someone always ready to help. That night, a car accident had drastically changed the course of his life. The crash had been severe, and although he survived the initial impact, a silent internal hemorrhage put his life in danger. While the team prepared the instruments, I thought about how often we fail to see the faces behind medical statistics. For many, he could have been just another polytrauma patient with abdominal bleeding, but for that mother waiting outside, he was everything: son, friend, future. And it was exactly that human weight that made the responsibility so overwhelming. Inside the operating room, there was a strange contrast. On one side, the almost mechanical precision of the team, every movement calculated, every action synchronized. On the other, the vulnerability of a young, fragile body silently fighting for life. The anesthesiologist monitored his vital signs, tension stamped on his face. One of the nurses whispered to me, "Doctor, he's so young. This can't be the end." Those words echoed inside me. This wasn't just a surgery. It was the attempt to save a story that had only just begun. As I washed my hands and prepared to begin, I remembered something my residency mentor used to say. Never forget that every patient is more than the body in front of you. They carry dreams, memories, and people who depend on them. And in that moment, those words made even more sense. Gabriel was not just a clinical case. He was a beloved son, a promising student, someone who still had an entire life ahead of him. When the doors of the room closed, I realized we were cut off from the outside world. Outside, his family prayed in silence. Inside, we were about to wage a battle against time, against blood loss, and against all the statistics that were stacked against us. And in the middle of that tension, something inside me said, this would not be an ordinary surgery. The first incisions were made, and it quickly became clear just how big the challenge ahead was. Gabriel's abdomen was filled with blood. The hemorrhage was extensive and diffuse, a sign that multiple vessels had been compromised in the accident. The surgical field barely allowed us to see the structures clearly. It was as if life itself were slipping away before our eyes. The anesthesiologist raised his voice so everyone could hear. Blood pressure dropping, 70/40. That phrase sounded like an alarm inside my mind. Time was no longer just precious, it was decisive. I quickly ordered, "Immediate suction, I need a clear field now." The nurses obeyed at once, but the blood flow seemed endless. With each passing second, Gabriel's body grew paler. His young, strong heart tried to resist, but the monitors revealed the uneven battle. The operating room, usually filled with technical conversations and rapid instructions, was now taken over by a tense silence, broken only by the sounds of machines and my firm commands. Everyone knew there was no margin for error. One of the residents assisting me murmured almost inaudibly, "Doctor, we won't be able to contain this." I turned to him and answered firmly, "Yes, we will. He will not leave us tonight." It was more than just a professional response. It was a promise I made to myself and, in some way, also to the mother waiting outside. We began searching for the primary source of the bleeding. We located a serious injury in the mesenteric artery, responsible for supplying part of the intestine. With each attempt to control the hemorrhage, the blood spurted out with a force that seemed to mock our efforts. I had participated in many complex surgeries, but that night, every step felt like walking on a tightrope about to snap. The anesthesiologist announced again, this time with heavy concern in his voice. Heart rate dropping, he's going into hypovolemic shock. My heart raced. I mentally checked the time. We were already in critical minutes. The amount of blood lost was massive, and even with transfusion, bags being administered, it seemed we couldn't replenish it at the same pace he was losing it. At that moment, I found myself standing at the very edge of medicine. Protocols indicated the next steps, but Gabriel's body was not responding as expected. Science told us the chances were running out, but for some reason I cannot explain, I couldn't accept that ending. I took a deep breath and told the team, stay strong. As long as there's a heartbeat, the fight continues. Those words seemed to reignite everyone's determination. Quick movements, steady hands, focused eyes. It was as if, in that moment, the entire room had a single heart beating along with his. Still, his vitals continued to plummet. The monitor, once with strong, regular waves, began showing an almost flat line, interrupted only by weak peaks. The alarms filled the room with a cruel warning. We were about to lose him, and it was exactly when hope seemed to vanish that something unexpected began to happen. The monitor triggered a sharper alarm. The heart line nearly flatlined, and the silence that followed was suffocating. For an instant, everyone in the operating room felt the weight of the inevitable. I looked at Gabriel's open abdomen and his pale face. It was as if life itself had decided to slip through our fingers. I commanded, "Cardiac massage now." The resident began chest compressions, while the anesthesiologist adjusted the adrenaline doses. The entire team was in maximum tension. Every movement seemed to carry the weight of fate. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly, and I knew we were surpassing the acceptable limit of time without response. And then, it happened. At the peak of that struggle, when logic could no longer sustain hope, I felt a strange calm invade the room. It was as if, for a brief moment, time had slowed down. The sound of alarms seemed distant, voices muffled. I remember looking at Gabriel's face and, for a second I will never forget, having the clear sensation that we were not alone there. I cannot explain it. It wasn't something visible, but the atmosphere changed, as if an invisible presence had filled the room. Some would say it was just adrenaline, others would call it an illusion caused by extreme stress. But deep down, I know there was something more. The next instant, against all odds, the monitor let out a strong beep. The line that had nearly flatlined returned to showing waves, fragile, but alive. Gabriel's heart had regained its rhythm. One of the residents exclaimed in disbelief, "He's back." The hands that had been trembling with tension now moved with renewed energy. The team worked as if given a second chance, and finally, we managed to control the hemorrhage and suture the artery. The bleeding gradually stopped and his vital signs began to stabilize. The mother outside had no idea what was happening at that very moment, but inside the room, we all felt we had witnessed something rare, something that transcended mere medical technique. As we finished the surgery, a respectful silence filled the air. It wasn't the same silence of despair from earlier, but one of reverence. Every glance exchanged among the team carried the same unspoken question: how was this possible? When the last stitch was made and the field removed, I took a deep breath and looked at the monitor again. Gabriel's heart beat steady, stubborn, as if refusing to give up. At that moment, I knew it hadn't been only a victory of science. We had witnessed something that defied explanations, something that even with all my years of experience I cannot put into words. And that's how, that early morning, the thin line between life and death turned into testimony of a miracle. When the surgery ended and Gabriel was transferred to the ICU, I stayed alone for a few minutes in the operating room, sitting on a chair in the corner. The sound of the team's footsteps fading still echoed, but inside me there was a profound silence. I had spent years studying, training, accumulating experience in hospitals and surgical centers. I had always trusted science because it gives us concrete tools to fight against death. But that night, I realized that science is not always enough to explain what we witness. I knew that statistically, Gabriel should not have survived. The amount of blood lost, the prolonged hypovolemic shock, the almost non-existent vital signs, everything pointed to a tragic outcome. And yet he was alive. More than that, he was stable, As I removed my surgical gloves and looked at my blood-stained hands, I thought, how many times do we believe we completely control life, when in truth, we are merely instruments? I am not saying medicine was not essential. Without the team, without the techniques, without every synchronized move, Gabriel would never have had the chance to return. But deep down, everyone in that room knew there was something more. A moment that escaped equations, guidelines, and logical explanations. I remember walking into the hallway and finding his mother sitting in a chair, trembling hands clutching a rosary. When I approached, she lifted her tear-filled eyes and asked, almost voiceless, "My son, is he alive?" I felt a knot in my throat, and I answered, with the firmness only truth can carry, "Yes, he is alive." At that moment, she broke down in tears, but they were tears of relief, of gratitude. She held my hands as if I had done something beyond what was possible. But deep inside, I knew it wasn't just my merit. This story stays with me to this day because it reminds me of something essential. Medicine is made of science, but also of humanity. We cannot ignore the inexplicable. It doesn't matter what each one calls it: faith, energy, destiny, miracle. The fact is, there are moments when the impossible manifests itself before our very eyes. And I want to speak directly to you, watching me right now. Perhaps you have been through a situation where there seemed to be no way out. Perhaps you felt the ground disappear beneath your feet. And yet, something happened. A detail, a coincidence, a force you cannot name, and you managed to move forward. If you have ever gone through this, then you understand what I mean. As a doctor, I have learned to value every heartbeat, every breath that insists on continuing. Because life, fragile as it may be, always finds a way to surprise us. And that is what I carry from this story. The certainty that we are not masters of destiny. We are merely its witnesses. When I left the hospital that morning, the sun was already rising. I was exhausted, my shoulders heavy from hours standing. But inside me there was a feeling I cannot describe with words alone. It was a mixture of gratitude, reverence, and humility before what had happened. The image of Gabriel, breathing steadily after everything we went through, was living proof that life always keeps cards we cannot predict. I had entered that room prepared to fight with all the weapons of science, but I left it reminded that sometimes what happens goes far beyond what we learn in books. And that is why I wanted to share this story with you, because I know that, at some point in your life, you too have witnessed something that had no explanation, something that touched your heart and made you rethink the world around you. If this story moved you, I want to ask you for something very simple, yet very important. Leave your like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear these words. And in the comments write, "I believe in miracles." Your interaction helps this message reach many more people. And maybe, who knows, it will be exactly what someone needs today to regain hope. And don't forget, the next video is already on its way. I won't reveal the theme, but I can guarantee it's a story just as impactful as this one, perhaps even more. So stay with me. With each story, you will realize that life inside a hospital holds secrets, mysteries, and lessons that none of us should ignore. Because I am a doctor, and despite all my experience, there are things I will never forget. And this was one of them. The first hours after the surgery were filled with uncertainty. Gabriel had survived the procedure, but his body was still fragile, unstable, like a flame flickering at the slightest breath. The ICU became his new battlefield. I checked on him several times to closely monitor his progress. The cardiac monitor now showed a regular rhythm, still delicate but steady. The mechanical ventilator kept air moving in and out of his lungs, and every movement was carefully observed by the nursing staff. In that silent environment, interrupted only by the constant beeping of machines, the scene felt surreal. To an outsider, it might have looked like just another patient connected to wires and tubes. But for me, who had felt his life slipping away, every heartbeat was the sound of victory. In the hallway, I met his mother again. This time she didn't ask me anything, she just hugged me tightly as if she wanted to thank me without words. I could feel the relief trembling in her hands, and at that moment, I realized something. Sometimes a family's hope is the invisible fuel that also sustains a medical team. During the following night, I replayed every detail of the surgery in my mind. Was it something we did that was decisive? Was it the technique, the speed, the synchronicity of the team? Or Was it something more? No matter how much I sought logical explanations, there was an empty space no answer could fill. And that emptiness reminded me of something doctors rarely admit. We too feel powerless. We too need to believe there is something beyond our capacity. 2 days later, Gabriel opened his eyes. His weak voice could barely form words, but I clearly remember the first whisper that came from his lips. "Am I alive?" I smiled, held his hand, and answered, "More alive than ever." He had no idea what had happened. He didn't know the thin line he had crossed, nor the battle we fought as his heart nearly gave up. But maybe that was better. Sometimes, a miracle doesn't need to be understood, only lived. For the team, his recovery was like a silent reminder that it is worth enduring the longest nights, the heaviest shifts, and the hardest battles. Because when life wins, all the effort suddenly makes sense. In the days that followed, the hospital seemed to change its atmosphere. It wasn't common for a case as severe as Gabriel's to have a positive outcome. The entire team still spoke about what had happened that night. Some called it luck, others coincidence. But in everyone's eyes, I could sense something deeper. They all knew they had witnessed something beyond routine medicine. One of the nurses who had worked beside me throughout the surgery found me in the hallway and whispered, "Doctor, I've never seen anything like it." The moment his signs disappeared, I was already waiting for you to declare the time of death. But when he came back, I felt something I can't explain, as if someone had purposely given him life again. Those words stuck with me, because they weren't just hers. Other professionals confided similar impressions. The anesthesiologist, known for his coldness and rationality, admitted, "I'm not one to believe in miracles, doctor." But that night, I doubted my own certainties. And me, I was torn as well. As a doctor, I had been trained to seek scientific explanations for everything. I needed to believe in protocols, tests, and concrete answers. But as a human being, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something greater had been at play. At night, alone at home, I thought about how many times I had stood before death. In some cases, I did everything right and still lost patience. In others, like Gabriel's, everything seemed lost, but life found a way to endure. And then I asked myself, where does science end? And where does the mystery of existence begin? This dilemma wasn't just mine. The entire team carried the same unease. In the cafeteria, days later, the case was still being discussed. Some would say, it was God. Others preferred the explanation. His body was young and it reacted at the very last moment. But deep down, everyone knew there was something about that story that didn't quite fit into the usual explanations. I also remembered Gabriel's mother. The moment I told her that her son was stable, her eyes shone in a way I will never forget. She didn't thank me as one thanks a doctor. She thanked me as someone who recognized that something beyond comprehension had taken place. And maybe that is the central point of this story. Medicine gives us instruments, but it does not give us all the answers. There are moments when we are forced to accept that life is greater than any manual, greater than any statistic. And I say this with humility. That night, as much as I held the scalpel, I was not the true one responsible for saving Gabriel. I was merely a witness to something that went beyond any logic. A few days later, I returned to the ICU to visit Gabriel. He was already off the machines, breathing on his own, stronger. When I entered the room, he smiled, still fragile, but alive. "Doctor, my mom said you saved me," he said in a low voice. I looked at him and replied sincerely, "We did our part, but there was something that night that even I can't explain. You were given a second chance. Make the most of it." His eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of gratitude. And in that moment, I realized this story wasn't just about a surgery. It was about life, and how sometimes the impossible decides to reveal itself before our very eyes. When I left the hospital, I thought about how often we walk through life believing we control everything. We believe we own our destiny, that we can predict and calculate each step. But deep down, life is full of cracks through which mystery seeps. And when that happens, it doesn't matter who you are, doctor, patient, relative, or simple witness, we are all reminded of our fragility, and at the same time of the greatness of existence. I never forgot that night in the operating room, and I confess, every time I step into one now, I carry not only the techniques I learned, but also the memory that there are forces we cannot control. I want to end this account by leaving a message for you, listening to me. Take care of your how. Life is the most precious treasure you have. Value every heartbeat, every breath, every person who walks beside you. Because in the end, we never know when life will surprise us. And if one day you feel you have reached your limit, remember Gabriel. Remember that even when everything seems lost, there can still be a new beginning. Before I finish, I must ask, if this story touched you in any way, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear these words. And in the comments write, "I believe in miracles." Your interaction helps this message reach many more people, and maybe, who knows, it will be exactly what someone needs today to regain hope. And don't forget, the next video is already on the way. I won't reveal the theme yet, but I can guarantee it will be just as impactful as this one, perhaps even more. So stay with me. With each story, you'll realize that life inside a hospital holds secrets, mysteries, and lessons that none of us should ignore. Because I am a doctor, and despite all my experience, there are things I will never forget. And this was one of them.